All right, so the recording's starting now. So Igor, you can present.
Mm-hmm. Hey guys. So first of all, special thanks to Thomas, to you, and to Nariman. Thomas, to you for organizing everything, and for Nariman to putting in all the time for free. Like it was really helpful for me, so I really appreciate it. Um, so this case that we did was on a hand that I played. It was a kind of interesting spot, and we put it on forums and. I was not quite sure how to play, and there was a lot of unsure people of how to play this hand as well. It was an ace king offsuit hand in a squeezed pot that missed the flop, and we were trying to come up. So basically, in this case, we're trying to look at a hand and predict how to play the hand using power equilab, using the graphs, equity graphs, just trying to come up with the conclusions just from the equity graphs, and then we're gonna check um, how solver would play those hands, um, and then we're gonna look at the adjustments that we would make versus a villain that bets that has a flop betting range weighted more towards value and not enough bluffs. So things we're going to be discussing this year, as I mentioned, we're going to be looking at the equity graph at first with ace king offs, comparing both villains range and heroes range, and just trying to make predictions from it. Then we're going to run it through solver, and then we're going to see what kind of adjustments we can make versus a villain that is value heavy on the flop. Um, so this is the hand right here. We have ace king offsuit. The action is it gets raised 4 big blinds under the gun. We get a caller and a cutoff, and we get a caller and a button, and we're in the big blind. So we decide to squeeze using ace king offsuit, um, and we get the original razor comes along. So the flop comes 9-7-4 with 2 hearts and a diamond. So we completely missed the flop. We have a backdoor flush draw, but I wasn't exactly sure how to play this hand. You know, whether this is a better check, whether it's a bet, whether it's check fold or check call. You know, so we're gonna look at first. We're gonna look at the ranges that we used for this situation. So this would be our squeezing range on the left. Would be our squeezing range that we're using versus in the situation. So as you can see, we got a whole bunch. Um, we got a lot of pocket pairs, tens. Then we have some smaller pocket pairs that we bet, like eights and nines at a smaller interval, and adding some bluffs, ace five, ace four suited at a small rate. Um, on the right side, we got our villains range. Um, so he is also flatting with some ace king or with a king king some of the time, you know, and he also has a lot of pocket pairs, even more than we do, and some suited connectors. So these are the two ranges that are going to be interacting with each other. In this slide right here, I'm showing you basically how these two ranges connected with the board, and then so this will dictate a lot of our strategy. So as you can see, and in the middle, the graph that you see in the middle is the interaction of equities. Um, for the ranges, the blue one is the heroes range, and green one is the villains range. So first, let's look at how both ranges connect with the board. So on the left side, that would be the villains range. So he connects much better in terms of the nut advantage because he has 8% of sets where we only have less than 1%. We do have a lot more overpairs. We have 40%. He has 28%. But he does have the nut advantage. So and he does have some hands that we should be worried about. Um, so that means that because going to next slide, this is a better view of the equity distribution that is showing. So blue and green line, these are the ranges, and this, as you can see, going from right to left, the more left you go, the higher the equities are, and the more top of the range is. So this is 50% equity right here. So as you can see, they have the nut advantage, the green. These are the nut hands, like the sets, sevens, fours, nines. But below that, as you can see, after that, we have a pretty big advantage. We have a lot of higher pocket pairs, um, and just our other hands in the value range. As you can see here, our this line is above green line, so it means that pretty much these are our value hands, equity hands, and they can get a lot of value from the villains range because the villains range is below. So um, we c- so basically drawing conclusions from this though is we can get value from villain with a lot of our value hands because like as you can see they're above in equity. So when let's say we have queen queen, you can have jack jack, so like we can get a lot of value, but we have to be, because of the presence of the nuts for the villain, we have to be very careful about um, because if we bet too big and we bet everything, we can get value owned where he will only call us with better. So because of that, and knowing that we still can get value from some of his range here, that it's best that we separate we have multiple bet sizes here. So if we bet small, that we can smaller size, that we can still get value from a lot of his hands, you know. And then in this portion right here, for instance, we can bet bigger because this part of our range is less vulnerable than this part of our range, but we can still get. Uh, it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have this part of our range right here doesn't have to worry as much um, uh, than this part of a range, because when we value bet this, we can still oftentimes get called by hands that are better than our hand. Um, so because of this, it's better to bet this part of our range, oftentimes at a smaller bet size, because we can still get called by his weaker part of his range, and we also have equity. Where here we're only more worried about the nuts, so we can still get called by also weaker part of his range, but we can bet bigger at the same time. Um, because of the presence of like this, because clearly we have to split our range here into smaller size and a bigger size. It's ideal that we, to keep a balanced strategy and to keep the villain guessing, that we split our entire range into multiple bet sizing and have just pretty much every most hands with a smaller and bigger bet sizing, although some part of our ranges do favor um, bigger bet size and smaller bet size. Like for instance, hands that are top of our range, that are like, let's say, ace ace or king king, they're more vulnerable. They're less vulnerable to being outdrawn. Um, so we can use them to bet smaller with them, with a high frequency, and use those hands our um, to protect our other parts of the range that is weak, that we're also going to be betting as bluffs. Um, so I looked at the distribution of where ace kings would be, ace king offsuit on the graph, um, and so it basically, the distribution of ace king offsuit would lie somewhere in between here and here. So you can see both these hands, they still have quite a lot of equity. They still have just under 50% equity. 40 something, and that's quite a lot of equity. And that is too much equity, to fold, just to fold very easily. So we should definitely try to do something with the hands. Um, Oftentimes, probably checking is a good idea, or calling. Um, so these are the predictions that we made based on looking at the graphs just now. That we should split our range into betting and checking range, and that we should be careful because villain does have the nut advantage. Um, and the second predictions, that we should have two different bet sizes, because like I said, there's parts of our range that if we bet too big, we are just gonna get value owned, where villain will only call with a better part of his range. Um, you know. So next slide right here is we're looking at just a general. So now that we made the predictions using the graphs, we can look at the solver now. And this thing right here, what it's showing you, it's showing you hero's entire range on the flop. Right here, you can see that on the left, this shows you that we do separate our range into multiple bet sizes, um, and that the solver prefers smaller size and a bigger size. This one's right here is 25%, and the other one is 50%. Um, and then you can also see that, just like we mentioned, that um, for the higher pocket pairs, as you can see, ace, ace, king, king, um, the simulation does prefer to use a smaller bet size, because like I mentioned before, it's less vulnerable. But at the same time, as you can see, he's using the same bet sizes on the hands that did not connect to protect them. So then we don't have to bet as much, and just waste extra. Basically, that in case that when we do call, we're not paying extra what we don't need. Um, so yeah, so this basically shows you that, and then here it shows you how we play ace king offsuit on the flop. As you can see, um, we're pretty much checking all our ace king offsuits. We're pretty much the villain prefers to check and bet 1/4, pretty small here. And then it prefers when we have ace king of hearts, when we have a backdoor flush draw, when when we have either an ace or a king with a heart, um, because of the presence of the backdoor flush draw and the additional equity, the simulation often prefers to bet these combos right here, where we're checking more often, um, or betting less when we do bet a smaller bet size when we don't have that. Um, so here, this is just to quickly to show you that when we do check, this is how villain splits his betting range. So as you can see, villain bets a lot of the broadways, a lot of pretty much a lot of his missed cards. He bets and checks a lot of his pocket pairs. Um, you know, so as you can see, he does bet a lot of hands that don't connect. Like I said, a lot of broadways, a lot of ace X suited. Um, so this is right here shows you how we would be playing our range versus ace versus a bet when the villain bets on the flop. Um, and as you can see, the strategy becomes where we're pretty much folding out all of our ace king. We're indifferent with the ace king, with the ace king that doesn't have a heart. So we're indifferent to either calling or folding. But the ones that have the heart, um, we choose to call a lot of the time and raise sometimes. So the higher equity hands. So we do continue with a lot of the ace king with the heart. by either calling or raising. Um, so now we're gonna look at a situation where the villain is playing a bit different from the GTO strategy, and he made some adjustments, um, and we're gonna see how we can adjust to it ourselves. So in this slide right here, you can see on your left side. So these are ranges for the villain. This is the flop betting ranges. This is basically to show you on the left side, you see the GTO, ideal GTO breakdown of how the villain would play his hand. You can see um, that this is pretty straightforward on the left. That's just his standard. You can see that at the bottom here, this shows you equity of his entire range. So at the left, at the very left, this is his value range. And at the right, that's his bluffing range. So you can pretty much see that villain's pretty balanced. He does bet his value, his best value, and he also does a lot of betting with his bluffs here. But in this scenario on the right, we made it that villain will be calling. He will be betting more over pairs. Right here, you can see there's much more betting over pairs. We're betting backdoor open-ended straight draw and gut shot a little bit, and we're pretty much betting more flush draws. Um, so you can see here by this equity graph at the bottom that it shows you that the strategy for the villain has changed. That that he's still betting a lot of his value right here. We can see the yellow. It shows you the betting. Um, you know, so he's still betting he's betting more pocket pairs. He's betting all his high equity hands more, but he is checking more of his bluffs. He's not betting his bluffs as much. So he's much more weighted towards value here than bluffs. Um, so because of that, we as a hero we need to make an adjustment towards the villain versus his play, and the conclusion that we come up with that the best adjustments to be made would be to just if we basically is overfolding more would be the best adjustment, and then just calling down more with our pocket pairs, or sometime raising with some of them. Um, so this next slide right here, it shows you uh, how exactly ace king would be affected by the both of these strategies with the GTO solution. So on the left we have villain standard strategy, GTO strategy, and at the bottom here you can see I did make a mistake here.
Yeah,
This should
the
be
ace
ace king
queens. It's
offsuit.
fine.
Yeah, this should be
Yeah.
ace king offsuit. Um, okay, well, the point would be that we would be calling down more with ace king of hearts, as I showed before. But whenever there's a heart combination in there, either ace of hearts or king of hearts, versus a standard strategy, and we're still folding. We will still be folding pretty much all our ace king offset folding, or sometimes calling indifferent. Where uh, in the adjusted strategy where villain is more value heavy, we're pretty much absolutely folding all our ace kings offsuit, and then we're pretty much choosing to play a raise or fold strategy with the ace king of hearts, with the heart, whether there's an ace of hearts or a king of hearts. So that's the big adjustment. And if we think that villain is not gonna fold versus our raise with the ace king suited, then we can not suited but with a heart then we can overfold that as well, and just compensate by raising with our big pocket pairs. Um, so yeah, so this is the conclusion right here, that we should be overfolding and sometimes raising ace king offset versus a value heavy villain. That's the end of my presentation. Any questions?
Yeah, I've got a few comments. So it was a good presentation, good overview about what was going on. Can I see the hand history again?
Yeah, sure.
For
Yep.
that?
Yep.
Uh,
So that would be right here.
Yes, that's pretty good. So it's a good analysis of the post flop. Yeah, I guess you can check folding. It's this 1/4, 1/3 pot bet against a villain that's too value heavy.
Mm-hmm.
And I imagine that if in your no lock sim you locked all the sets as well, then yeah, it's a pretty easy fold. What would be more interesting is maybe I'm not sure about how easy it is to do in GTO Plus, but no locking the flop strategy to your opponent's betting strategy. So if you look at your opponent's betting strategy and no lock something,
Mm-hmm.
and then solve around that, how your flop strategy with it changes. So how often you end up checking his hand, and I imagine you'd end up um, probably checking a few different hands a bit more often,
Mm-hmm.
because then you end up in this weird case where if you check your ace king and then your opponent checks, their check back range just becomes very weak,
Mm-hmm.
and so then you can start doing strange stuff like betting really thin for value on the next street or betting very big on the next street. Of course, you can't really bet very big because the SPR is so low here, but
Mm-hmm.
betting very thin on the next street. So maybe something to look into the next time you run an analysis like this. But overall, I think it was a very good analysis.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
In terms of the nut advantage versus range advantage,
Mm-hmm.
one thing to talk about is how the SPR affects the strategy for both players. In terms of the nut advantage versus range advantage, so here villain's got a lot of the sets in the range that you allocated to him.
Yeah.
Compared to you've got more over pairs, and that's true. But with the SPR being very low,
Yeah.
the fact that villain has sets doesn't matter quite as much
Mm-hmm.
as the fact that you've got lots of over pairs. So that's one thing that you could discuss.
Yeah. Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, sure.
What's the threshold for figuring out the SPR borderline for when it becomes important?
It's always important. It's just like how important is it? So
Mm-hmm.
obviously, if your opponent's got like 50% nuts and 50%
Oh
air,
no.
then like you can't really do too much,
Oh,
no matter
sorry.
what
No,
the
I meant
SPR is.
the SPR. Like, what's the SPR number where it becomes less relevant whether he has not advantage for sets and stuff like that?
Or the thing is, the relative nuts depends on what the SPR is. So
Mm-hmm.
the deeper the SPR is, the more the very strong hands become quite important. And the lower the
Mm-hmm.
SPR is, the less that is, right?
Mm-hmm.
So here, for example, like top set and aces, that are not going to be too different in terms of both equity and as well as expectation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, just because the SPR is too low to do too much with either of them.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So Thomas, one thing I would like to add is that in terms of the node locking that Igor did, we assumed the flop play of hero because hero is first to act and he is first to play. So the flop play, we assume it stays GTO. I know it changes if we know villain is gonna bet in a value heavy range, but we assumed the flop play for villain is GTO, and we locked it, and then we gave a value-heavy betting range to villain after we check, and then we start solving it after. Another approach would have been to only log villain's betting range and see how hero's flop play is going to change.
Yeah, that's what I was talking about earlier.
Right. So
That's probably it's probably a slightly better way of doing it if you know villain's tendency. It's just you have to be relatively strong in your assumption of villain tendency in order to do that. If you're not super strong, then you should just do it the normal way, play GTO, and then once you face that node, you can continue from there.
Yes,
but if you're quite confident in at least one of the villain's tendencies, you can construct a decent counter strategy around that by no locking that particular spot.
Yes,
obviously
that's right.
you probably don't want to change it too much. I'm pretty sure in GTO Plus you can no lock individual hands to always bet or always check or whatever. So like here, for example, you might no lock like pocket nines, pocket sevens, like maybe pocket tens and pocket jacks or whatever the other pairs into an always bet, and then see how that works.
Right. So Igor, can you show the chart that shows how the betting range for villain that is value heavy, which is comparing two betting range side by side?
Yeah, sure.
So I think it was this one. So we did not liberally deviate from GTO for the value heavy assumption. We only did a tiny bit of adjustment. We assumed the sets are played the same for GTO and value heavy. As you see, the sets are the same. The only adjustment we did was we assumed he's betting pocket tens more often than GTO, and we removed a tiny version of low equity bluffs. And even this slight change resulted to play ace king as raise fold. If we even add sets to bet all the time for the value heavy villain, I think this becomes more magnified, and we should definitely play raise fold versus this villain. So we did not change the sets at all. We just changed the pocket 10 for the overpairs.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. The thing is, changing pocket tens, specifically pocket tens, is probably not the best because pocket tens is sort of closer to the middle of the top middle of villains. It's sort of towards the bottom of villains' value range, actually.
Right.
So putting that in would shift you more towards a raise as a bluff, because then your value hands can get more value from that pocket tens that's in the betting range. But if you didn't have pocket tens there and you put the sets in instead, I'm sure ace king would be pretty much an always fold.
I see.
Regardless of whether it's got a heart or not. Just because, yeah, it's like you're talking about the very top, but the very top is only a few percent, so probably going to be splitting hairs there. Yeah, so you really have to. So it's good that we're doing some node locking, and that's fine. The trick with node locking is to probably play around with the ranges a lot more, and to figure out on maybe some sort of sliding scale or whatever, exactly what changes you can make to villain's range and exactly how you can deviate from that. That's probably the best way to learn using node locking. So if you think your opponent is value heavy when they bet, you really want to have a pretty good definition of what that means. Does that mean that they are pretty normal in terms of what hands they would bet for value? So they bet close to GTO with their value hands, and then not bluff as much. So that could be true, and that's probably what you've shown here. Maybe what you've shown here is probably a villain that is a little bit sort of wants to bet for protection with their middling hands a bit too often, and is a bit scared to bluff.
Right.
Which sure is a bit value heavy, but it's not value heavy in the sense that when they always have a strong hand, they're always going to bet it.
Their sets, for example.
Yeah. So if instead you know locked all the sets and all the overpairs to betting, and then played your range against, and then reran a sim from the flop to see how your flop strategy would change. I'd imagine there'd be quite a bit more checking involved, simply because villain's going to be betting too much. And when villain does check back, their checking range is so weak that you just blast them for value on the turn.
Right.
Does that sort of make sense? So if villain ends up betting like all of the overpairs, all of their sets, then basically you would, in order to have a decent up off the value ratio, they have to be bluffing quite frequently. So there's that. So in terms of the GTO, you really want to say, okay, are they value heavy or they're betting too often? And it's a subtle difference.
Exactly.
If you get them to bet all the overpairs on all their sets and if you run it in the sim, the sim will probably want to bet quite frequently with a lot of their hands, and accept the fact that you're going to just jam on them after they bet, because it's better than the alternative, getting you to overfold the flop, then get jammed on whatever turns when they check back. So yeah, I think you should be a little bit more slightly better well defined with the terms that you want to use for describing the different villains. Have a good idea about what exactly you think that your opponent's mistakes are. Exactly what you think their deviations from GTO is. So if you think that your opponent was making exactly this deviation, then yeah, sure, you can have the ace king with the ace of hearts play jam or fold. And that's fine. But if you had a slightly different villain who was like, okay, I want to actually bet all of my overpairs and sets, and then not bluff at all, and then you can see what your entire strategy is like, right? I imagine in that sort of case, you'd end up checking your entire range on the flop, and then against the bet, you'd be playing essentially raise or fold, and then when they check, you end up just blasting them on the turn because they're so weak.
Yeah. But when you say blasting on a turn, are we just
like you're just betting at a very high frequency, for a near geometric size.
But are we, if we're betting and they can't call, are we just bluffing? Or if they're so weak on the turn?
They're so weak they have to call because of whatever mistake that they made on the flop. Either like if you bet your entire range, because they're so weak, I imagine that'd be fine, and then you just pick up the pot like 90% of the time.
Okay.
Because if he's gonna bet all his sets and overpairs once we check to him, so when he checks back, then he has nothing.
Yeah, so and then like a hand like ace king suddenly becomes a value hand on the turn.
Exactly.
But when we value bet it on a turn, are we hoping that we get called by something weaker?
Yeah, because if you know that your opponent had bet all their overpairs and basically had bet most of their pairs on the flop, once you've got ace king, once you bet the turn, you're hoping to get called by like ace queen, king queen, that kind of stuff.
Okay.
Yeah, it's difficult to wrap your head around because in real play it doesn't make too much sense. You just expect your opponent to fold if they don't have anything, and they will. So this is against a much weaker player, but against a much weaker opponent who's just going to bet all the overpairs and says, and then check back some of their janky pairs or whatever, as well as all the overcards. On the turn, you'd be betting like everything and expect them to fold a lot.
Right. So we would try to overbluff on the turn as a hero.
Well, no, you don't have to overbluff because you've got so many strong hands compared to their range. So if you checked almost everything, you would have a bunch of strong hands as well. And then if they bet, they're very overpair heavy, and so then you can do stuff like jamming aces and kings into that. for value.
Right. So on the turn when they check flop and when they check flop, we hope that we still can bet and get called by worse.
With ace king in specifically,
Yeah.
it'd be closer to value than it would be a bluff at that stage, because they just don't have very many strong hands left over.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Gotcha.
So yeah, you want to be a bit more specific in terms of what you mean by value heavy, because fiddling with the ranges a bit, you'll get very different answers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And solving for different spots from different spots onwards, we get different answers as well. So like if you know locked here and then you would change your flop checking strategy and betting strategy in response to your opponent's betting strategy. If you check, then you get a slightly different answer as well. Leaning more towards raise fold with this kind of hand, the ace king, with the heart. So it's good that you picked that up, but if you fiddle with it a bit more, you'll be able to see a bit of a wider range of possible answers depending on the villain that you have in front of you. And that's really the trick with getting the maximum amount of value against weaker opponents is isolating exactly the biggest weakness that they have, and then changing like your entire strategy to exploit that weakness as best as you can.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not going to be like a chain of little weaknesses that you're going to exploit. You're just going to exploit the one big one that they have. It's a glaring hole in their game. And it might not be on the specific flop, right? They might have one weakness on this flop and then the opposite weakness on a different flop. But you sort of have to know what's what.
Yeah.
But most people will have the same sort of weakness. That most people will either be too aggressive or too value heavy or bluff too much or be too passive, etc. And you have to know how to sort of respond against each of them. And it sort of goes back to like the really old school stuff. But the old school stuff is fine if you can justify it by looking at the different sims and playing around with the ranges. Another thing that you could also do is probably fiddle around with the pre-flop ranges a little bit. So, for example, pre-flop, one of the things that you can do, and this wasn't discussed, but I'll touch on it now. It's probably not super important for the analysis which you did. But one of the things that you can do pre-flop when you face like an open and then two calls, and then they put in like 10% of the effective stack, essentially is in the middle right now.
Yeah.
With a hand like ace king off, shove. Sorry, I'll say it again. With a hand like ace king off, you can just shove all in pre-flop there.
That's not me.
Yeah, I think
Naraman's
mic is playing up. So yeah, with ace king off, you can often just shove pre-flop in a lot of these spots. Can you go back to the hand? I think you were closing the action,
sure.
were you?
So it was
Yeah, you're on the big line. When you're closing the action like this, yeah, you don't really want to have too much of a calling range. Yeah, and that's fine.
So you would suggest just jamming there, going all in?
Yeah, that's what I would do if I had this hand pre-flop.
Yeah,
I
it
would
depends,
just go all in.
The amount of as Thomas mentioned, how much of the effective stack there is in the middle. So if it is too deep, maybe not, but around 100 big blind, like how much dead money is in there right now? Is like
it's so it's like 12
big blind plus your big blind, 13 big blind is in there.
Yeah.
And well, if it is 100 big blind, it's 13% of the stacks, which is a significant amount.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, even 121 big blinds deep,
But we would
Yeah,
be
I mean, like you're only that deep against undergun one, against cutoff and deal. You're less than that. So
Right.
I'd be very very happy to shove ace king off here,
You're
as well as
right.
stuff like kings and queens. And then if I wanted to go for a small size like this one, it would be like aces and then ace king suited. This is getting towards the advanced pre-flop stuff that you can do. So it's not like a huge necessary part of your game to include. But if you wanted just to make one slight adjustment, ace king offsuit is one of the best hands to use as a pre-flop shove.
mhm.
Um, and you don't really even have to have value within that shoving range, just because ace king offsuit is so hard to beat anyway. It is difficult for your opponent to continue with any hands. So basically, if you wanted to improve your pre-flop game slightly in spots like this where there's a lot of money in the middle, and you're looking at ace king offsuit, you can just go all in pre-flop, and remember that you're actually bluffing. So when you get called, don't expect to win a huge amount of the time.
So our entire all-in range will be like queen plus ace king offsuit plus.
Not aces.
Yeah, probably not aces. Aces can go for the smaller size. So
Mm,
like queens and queens, kings, and ace king offsuit is a good sort of range to use. If you're too scared of using queens, then don't use queens. But definitely you can do it with stuff like kings and then ace king offsuit together.
Mhm.
They work well together as a shoving pair. And then when the ranges get wide, you can add like queens and even ace. If it's really wide, then you can add like jacks and ace queen offsuit.
mhm.
Um, Definitely ace king offsuit, a little bit ace king suited. You
Thomas,
have
I
to,
remember you said an SPR 10 or below. So this is in accordance with the 10% of the stack, right? You said if SPR is 10% or 10 or below, you can start shoving ace king off with pocket kings.
yeah. I mean, it's like by start, you mean like it's like 1% of the time, but like the more money that's in the middle, the better ace king offsuit becomes as a the semi bluff shove,
Right.
But
Because
especially out of position.
we're always hoping that they fold, right? Fold is always the ideal scenario when we shove.
Yeah. Like when you get called, you're going to get called by either ace king or a pocket pair, so you're going to be behind that range.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Of course, if you're playing against very weak opponents, some of them might like call with ace queen, so that's nice, but don't expect that too often as you
Mm-hmm.
move up.
Okay.
It's yeah, shoving ace king here is very effective against weaker opponents, especially like here cutoff and button. They shouldn't really be calling. There's 4v1 open, especially not cutoff. So when you've got ace king here pre-flop, shoving is pretty good because essentially the cutoff has put quite a bit of dead money and so has the button, because you're not really expecting the cutoff or the button to show up with a hand that
Yeah.
beats you too often. Most of
Right.
the time, it's going to be flipping against them if they decide to call.
Mm-hmm.
So it's pretty nice from that point of view. You only really have to worry about the under the gun, the top of the under the gun range. So say under the gun one opens like 14%, and then you're only worried about like the 0.9
Yeah. Of his range.
ish percent of his range, which is the
Right.
kings and aces, and the rest you're basically flipping against. So you'd be worried about 0.9 divided by 14, whatever that is, like 7%.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe some weird stuff that cutoff and button can show up with, some weird kings and aces that they can show up with a few percent of the time. So then
Mm-hmm.
you run into kings plus like 10% of the time
Mm-hmm.
doing this, which is fine. The rest of the time, maybe good 20% of the time you're flipping a coin, and then hopefully the rest of it you get a fold, and then that's how you get your EV doing this.
Right.
Actually, probably less than 10% of the time because of your double blocker effect of the ace king. So with that, you probably want to halve it. So probably
like,
around 5% of the time you're running into king plus.
You said ace king off is double blocking also ace king suited. That was something interesting you said once.
Yeah, I mean that's not super important here, but when the range gets super narrow, it's something to think about.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's not super important, but here, but when the range get very very narrow, here the main thing ace king offsuit double blocks aces and kings, so that 0.9% becomes like 0.5%. So then yeah, you might get called by kings plus like 5% of the time in total. And the rest is either you're flipping or you get a fold, which is pretty good in terms of your expectation. You can calculate that roughly. You can go in Equilab and estimate what your equity is against the calling range, and then your fold equity, and do the math on that and figure out roughly what your expectation is for shoving here, and you'll see that it's quite positive.
Hey guys, I'm really sorry. I need to go to the washroom real quick. I'll be right back in 2 minutes. Is that okay?
Sure.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Max, you just got here. Yeah, we're just talking about this hand history. So yeah, I go give a good presentation on this and sort of the post flop ideas about the node locking against a value heavy opponent. And we're just talking a bit more about that.
Okay.
Yeah, so what we were saying earlier is that here on the flop against a value heavy opponent, an opponent that would bet the flop very often for value, you could there's the ways you sort of adjust to that. So if they're betting like with overpairs and sets and stuff, but they're checking back all their weak hands, the way you can sort of adjust to that is to check quite frequently with most of your range. And the reason being is because when your opponent checks back, you essentially win the pot because their range is so weak. You can bet into them on the turn, or on any turn, because their range is very weak. And then you would expect a lot of folds because they really just can't hold on. And when they do bet into you, when you've got a strong hand, you can shove a bit more because you're not really worried about them having any bluffs. Which is sort of the reason why you have calls in the first place. You sort of have calls hoping your opponent continues bluffing, but if your opponent doesn't have any bluffs, you might as well shove and get your value now.
Oh, okay.
So the reason we decided to go with this hand was that Igor posted this hand in the channels, and everybody was having different ideas of how you should play ace king, because the bet was small. Everybody was saying you should check raise or you should check call. This is just too tight to fold. So we wanted to know the actual answer, and we started assuming like some assumptions, but at the same time we did not want to deviate too much from GTO. So the assumptions we made, we assumed that like villains, especially in lower stake limit, they bet for protection a bit more. So we added pocket tens to be betting all the time, and they don't bluff enough. And then we saw the post flop answers using GTO plus.
Yeah, I'm back.
All right. So if Igor if you're done, I gotta go. Good job. We will be in touch. Thomas, is there anything you do you need me now?
No. So yeah, thanks so much, Igor, for your presentation. That was very good.
Yeah, I just
so
want to say thank you one more time. Thomas, for just putting out this whole site together and for putting in all the work
Yeah.
and connecting people. Like this helped me like really a lot just in the last few months. I feel like I got so much better. And
Excellent. Excellent.
to Nariman, just thank you so much for just
No
dedicating time. Because like what you
Sure.
did, it's like cost like hundreds of dollars, like and you did it for free, and I really appreciate your help. So thank you to both
You're
of you.
welcome. I learned from Thomas. He goes free, I go free too.
Right.
All right. Thanks, guys.
So
Okay,
we will be in touch. Thank you, guys. Have a
yes.
good day. Bye.
Thank you. Have a good day, guys. Take care.